Welcome. We'll get started. I'm realizing this is not a room that we normally meet in, and it's also the world of ice out there, so it takes a really long time to get everywhere. Adele Perry Nadishnikas, Gawin ni Dudimsi, Winnipeg, University of Manitoba, Induji, Zaganash Kwe, Ninda. My name's Adele Perry. I live and work in Winnipeg. I'm a settler and a white woman. I don't know my clan, and I'm happy to be here with all of you in what is the third, the sweet middle of this year's Critical Conversation series. And this is a public seminar series that the Center for Human Rights Research has run since it began way back in 2012. And it's usually been held in conjunction with a seminar. And we've been able to bring a range of speakers to a public and also open up kind of human rights, Indigenous rights related research to a wider public into the campus. And so this year's Critical Conversation series and the class that goes with it, shout out to everybody in the class who's here, it's Histories of Gender, the Body, Reproduction, and Care in Canada. This is a fit with our research theme on reproductive and sexual rights, but also works to expand that in important new directions, ones that we owe to the insights of trans, inclusive feminist thinking, and also to Indigenous and Black feminist thought. And it's from here in particular that we learned that reproductive justice is not simply about the right to have or not have children, but it's also profoundly about the ability to care for those children in sustainable and culturally appropriate ways. And I can think of no better scholar to speak to this than Dr. Sarah Nicol. I was reminded of the crucial work that Sarah has done in thinking about Indigenous feminisms with one of the first emails I opened this morning, and it was a call for papers from 2 US-based scholars that began with a quote from Nicol, reminding us, and I quote here, of the longevity and flexibility of Indigenous feminisms and the imperative to act in good relation to each other and to the communities we are tied to. In her collection, co-edited with Amanda Fair, that is for sale at the back of the room, thank you to our friends at the University of Manitoba Press, and in another collection on Indigenous feminisms that's in progress, Dr. Nicol is very much a theorist. But she is also very much a historian who works with both oral and written records to produce new knowledge about Indigenous women's political history. She's the author of the prize-winning Assembling Unity, Indigenous Politics, Gender, and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, published in 2019, and has a new manuscript on Indigenous women's political and social work in progress, and also a dazzling list of articles and chapters. And it's from this recent work on Indigenous women's political history in the 20th century that Dr. Nicol will draw on today in her talk. And I want to thank the Center for Human Rights Research, especially Pauline Tennant, Angela Ciceron, and Denise McInnes for their work in making this series happen. We've also benefited from the support of the Margaret Lawrence Endowment Fund of the Women's and Gender Studies Program, and from the Department of History, who sprung for the snacks. And we're very grateful for that as well. And we're also grateful again to the University of Manitoba Press, who've brought the Nicol and Fair collection and some other related books that you might want to buy. And you're welcome to, as we go on, get up and help yourself to food and a little bit of book shopping as you see fit. So Dr. Nicol is Tk'emlúpsemc. She is an associate professor in history, classics, and religion at the University of Alberta. She's a prodigious scholar whose work bridges disciplines and prompts us to think in new ways about Indigenous women's past, present, and future. She is also a generous and engaged colleague, and we are enormously lucky to have her here for what is her very first visit to Treaty 1. And we meet here in the context of the territories of the Anishinaabe Innu people, the Red River Métis, bound by the promises of Treaty 1 and of the Manitoba Act. Our drinking water comes from the east, from Treaty 3, and our hydroelectric power, mainly from Treaty 5 to the north. And it's here, amidst all of these relations and these commitments, that we are really honored to have Dr. Nicol speak. And she'll be speaking for about 45 minutes, an hour, somewhere around there, and then we'll take a few questions. But I will turn things over to Dr. Nicol.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks so much, Adele. I'm just going to open my laptop here. Is that microphone at the right spot? Okay. Oh, sorry, I have to put my password in. I should have just used paper like normal people, but instead I'm going to be complicated. Well, thank you all for being here today, for welcoming me for my first trip to Winnipeg. It's so exciting. Heart of the Métis homelands, this sacred territory. I'm really grateful to be here. So, Letasquit, good afternoon. Sarah Nicol Rensquest, Tk'emlúpsemc to Equin. My name is Sarah Nicol. I'm a member of Tk'emlúpsemc. And I'm really so excited to be here today to talk about some work that comes out of my next book project that is currently at the press awaiting peer review. So I'm just like on pins and needles right now. But it's exploring Indigenous women's broad political work across BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. So I take a very specific definition of the West, and I recognize that I'm excluding Manitoba, so I'm just going to kind of shrink down here a little bit. But between the 1950s and 1980s, and this work has taken me across the West, interviewing so many lovely Indigenous women and elders, including members of my own family, which is always a treat, who were active in political organizations and informal community groups, were on their own, and they were, as many women told me in their interviews, they were simply doing what needed to be done. And that work was really about just trying to make their lives and the lives of their families and communities better. So this included things like creating Indigenous-run daycares and women's shelters and halfway houses, and challenging the child welfare system. And that's this latter point is where my comments come today. So I am starting off in the very small community of Splat-in to Tk'emlúpsemc, which is, I've circled it here, so hopefully you can see I tried to circle it twice so that it was visible. This is one of the 17 Tk'emlúpsemc communities of my own nation, and this one is located in the northern part of the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia. Between 1951 and 1979, Splat-in families were in crisis. In 1951, as many of you might know, the Indian Act was amended to include Section 88, and that dictated that all provincial laws of general application would be applied to First Nations people. And the law that is making the most impact here is provincial child welfare laws. So as a result, between 1951 and 1979, the community of roughly 300 people, and it's formally known as the Tk'emlúpsemc Indian Band, which becomes relevant later on, it saw provincial child welfare services apprehend over 100 of their children. And that's across these 3 reserve communities there. Now, most of these children, unsurprisingly, were fostered or adopted out to non-Indigenous families across the province, across Canada, and across the world. Birth families were often left in the dark about what happened to their children. And often, and again, perhaps unsurprisingly, these apprehensions were fueled in part by non-Indigenous social workers' very Eurocentric views about what constituted safe and appropriate care, but also what family structures should look like. So Splat-in youngster Sheila Kay, for instance, recalled how she and her siblings were placed in foster care simply because their father left them with extended family while he went to work. So we can see that Indigenous peoples' forms of labor and their forms of childcare are under very intense scrutiny. For Splat-in members, the provincial child welfare system intensified family and community and cultural breakdown, which tended to prolong rather than remedy some of the intergenerational trauma from residential schools, from colonial policies that were historic but also ongoing. And of course, Splat-in, they were not alone in their grief and frustration. At a June 1980 conference of the Canadian Council on Social Development, a former BC Minister of Human Resources Childcare Services Superintendent, I swear that's the actual title, a man by the name of Vic Belknap, characterized child welfare services for Indigenous peoples across Canada, but Splat-in specifically, as a national tragedy. And of course, what I'm referring to here is the infamous and ongoing Sixties Scoop, or child welfare crisis. The Sixties Scoop is a term that, while it's criticized for its failure to capture the longevity and perhaps depth of the child welfare crisis, is a term that's really well recognized today. Scholar Patrick Johnson coined the term in 1983 when he interviewed a former social worker in British Columbia who explained that workers would scoop children from nearby reserves soon after they were born. This scooping, of course, regularly involved coercion, misinformation, or even a complete lack of communication about the seizures. Stories abound of Indigenous women who believed they were signing temporary custody agreements in order to access respite or so they could access addictions or education programs, only to find that their children had been adopted. Others were not given due process through legal reviews for removals, for fostering, or for adoption. And many fought, often for years, in vain to regain custody of their children. According to Métis historian Alison Stevenson, many of these social workers truly believed they were acting in the best interests of the children. And while she acknowledged this, quote, points to the benevolent intent of individual social workers who sought to rescue children from the devastating material conditions they faced, they were unable to acknowledge the historical factors that led to those conditions, end quote. Instead, Stevenson and others like historian Margaret Jacobs have argued that throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Indigenous families were increasingly viewed as, quote, chronically dysfunctional and, quote, irredeemable. And this was something that fueled some of the unrelenting and very targeted child apprehensions. Now I need to drink, sorry. So there has been a relative and much needed explosion of scholarship on the Indigenous child welfare crisis in recent years. Yet with the important exception of Stevenson's work that looks at Indigenous child welfare in Saskatchewan, what is missing from these studies, in my opinion, is the concerted analysis and focus on the role that Indigenous women played in challenging child welfare practices and advocating for family rights. By at least the early 1960s in Canada's West, excluding Manitoba, Indigenous women clearly demonstrated that they understood the problems and causes of the child welfare crisis, and they had solutions in mind. They actively resisted settler child welfare models and pursued alternatives such as developing local receiving homes and foster homes for children, initiating community groups to oversee provincial child welfare activities, and using Indigenous women's political organizations to lobby for transparency and to lobby for structural changes to the child welfare system. And this work happened, at the local level, provincial, and even national level, as Indigenous women talked to each other and shared ideas and learned from each other to make concrete changes. So today I'm going to outline two unique responses to the child welfare crisis in Canada's West that involves one, increasing the numbers of Indigenous foster and adoptive homes with the 1974 to 1976 Voice of Alberta Native Women's Society foster care project, and two, establishing the first federally funded independent on-reserve child welfare agency with the bylaw for the care of our Indian children, Tk'emlúpsemc, see I said you'd need to know that, Tk'emlúpsemc Indian Band Bylaw number 3 in 1980. Now these case studies are just two examples of the broad work that Indigenous women were doing, but together I think they reveal the sustained, creative, and flexible efforts of Indigenous women's organizations and concerned individuals and communities to reshape Indigenous child welfare according to Indigenous values and perspectives and needs. And in both cases, the impact of these efforts have been long-standing, and they were really meaningful. So the foster care project not only recruited more Indigenous foster homes in Alberta, but also challenged existing relationships between Indigenous people and the provincial child welfare agents, and inspired local local child welfare initiatives in reserve communities. The Splat-in bylaw model for child welfare still operates today. It's gone through regular review processes and recently a modernization effort. And it remains the only model of its kind in Canada, but prompted other communities to take control of their child welfare through the delegation model and through the recognition of inherent jurisdiction for children and families. So first, the Voice of Alberta Native Women's Society, or VANIS as they're called, running between early 1974 and June 1976, the collaborative VANIS Foster Care Project was an innovative enterprise that saw the Provincial Indigenous Women's Organization. This was created in 1968 and had chapters that included First Nations and Métis women across the province. They partnered with Alberta Social Services and Community Health to undertake targeted community-based surveys of Indigenous child welfare and ultimately looked to increase the number of foster and adoptive homes across the province, Indigenous adoptive and foster homes. Both VANIS and Alberta Social Services were intimately familiar with the challenge at hand, and namely they were concerned with the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in non-Indigenous foster and adoptive homes. And they were really dedicated to lessening the hurdles for Indigenous fostering. VANIS members explained that the trauma of cultural dislocation in non-Indigenous foster homes had a really devastating impact on children. They noted that this was very frightening and disturbing to the Native child. Quote, "If they remain in the white society for any long period of time, the children lose their identity within the Native culture and language, which is very upsetting to the Native people." VANIS was clear in its position that it wasn't that non-Indigenous foster homes were bad or that the parents were bad or the homes were unsuitable, but rather they said, quote, "Non-Native homes fail because of cultural and linguistic differences." And social services largely agreed with this and was willing to do things differently, cooperating with VANIS to make improvements. So the foster care project appears to have roots in findings by a 3-member committee appointed by the Social Credit government in October 1972. Judge Catonio presented a 105-page report to health and, sorry, I keep using the microphone wrong, report to Health and Social Development Minister Neil Crawford, highlighting the asymmetry, as they called it, of Indigenous children in foster care, particularly in areas like Lac La Biche, Alberta, where 95% of children in care were either First Nations or Métis. Catonio and Crawford concluded that given this overrepresentation, Indigenous people should play a greater role in the lives of Indigenous children in care. On October 13th, 1972, the Edmonton Journal reported that the Department of Social Development suggested, quote, "Many qualified Native people also live in Alberta who could assist the provincial government, and there are province-wide organizations such as the Voice of Alberta Native Women, whose organizers could be called upon to form home-finding committees." At the VANIS general meeting the next day, President Bertha Clark Jones referenced the article and noted that, quote, "Social Development stated that VANIS could handle their proposed programs." So she quickly announced that VANIS would send Social Development a letter to initiate discussions about involvement in foster care. And then they spent the next year and a half or so making plans. By 1974, Art Bocher from the Alberta Foster Care Services was working closely with VANIS to develop a proposal to kind of develop the foster care program and to seek government funding. And they were successful in securing a grant of $90,000. As the project took shape, VANIS had several challenges to address. The lack of Indigenous foster homes was the primary concern, but the organization also hoped to develop community programming and support for Indigenous families to prevent apprehensions. It likewise wanted to address the pervasive issue of Indigenous families not receiving financial assistance when they were caring for relatives or other children. Many families did not know that they were eligible for financial assistance, were unsure of how to receive it, or were nervous that if they applied for such funding, they would lose their children. The resulting foster care program was multi-pronged as a result. It involved VANIS training and employing Indigenous women as field workers to promote Indigenous foster care and to recruit Indigenous foster homes across the province. But it also tasked the women with identifying and encouraging family programs and community programs, particularly in isolated regions, and surveying families that were caring for children without financial assistance. So this is how the project was organized. It was hierarchical. You can obviously see that VANIS and government agents have a role in this. So we have the program supervisor for foster care, the child welfare branch person, which is Art Bocher. He's at the top, followed by the VANIS president, which is Bertha Clark-Jones. Then the VANIS project coordinator, who's Clara Woodbridge. Then the VANIS zone district presidents, and those presidents oversaw the field workers, and each of the field workers were then connected to regional child welfare offices. The project also developed a foster care committee that was made up of the VANIS president, 3 vice presidents, a Native Secretariat representative, and Art Bocher. There were 22 field workers recruited, but only 15 remained for the duration of the project for lots of different reasons. But together they visited over 100 Métis and First Nations communities out of the available 146, so they did pretty well. The project included formal instruction for the field workers to better understand child welfare issues, and VANIS arranged for the women to train as foster care workers with the Department of Social Development. This instruction took place over 3 days, which you could probably already tell was not enough. It included sessions on what the project was, the functioning and programs of the child welfare branch, the foster care program, communication and interviewing skills, and the roles of the 14 regional offices. Many, like Edmonton field worker Lena Bumstead, felt that the training was partial and inadequate because, in her words, quote, "We were totally unfamiliar with foster care." For many of the women, their education in the realities of child welfare would come from personal experiences with the child welfare system, time spent with families and community members, and then to some extent and varying extents from the social workers. But prepared or not, the field workers had a monumental task in front of them. They were foundational to this project because they were the ones on the ground, and they were trying to recruit Indigenous families who were maybe interested in fostering but needed encouragement, often from another Indigenous person who understood them and could relate to them. To cultivate trust, field workers used a visiting approach in their assigned communities, and when possible, spoke to families in their Indigenous languages. For Bumstead, that meant sharing lots of coffee and tea and bannock in the 47 homes that she called on. And she visited with people and answered their questions. And from these visits, she received 19 applications for foster homes and 2 applications for families that were seeking guardianship of children that were currently in their care. For many field workers and families, these were enjoyable visits. Bumstead recalled the delight in engaging with the old people and catching up on news and just simply passing the time together. But of course, she and others heard heartbreaking stories of family breakdown and dislocation. And this was both difficult, but also confirmed the need for the VANIS project and solidified her decision to work on behalf of Indigenous families. In numerous cases, it was the rapport that field workers built with families that was directly responsible for their decision to foster. And here, the personal and effective elements of activism become really clear. Field workers were not simply just working for a cause, they were working with individuals with lived experiences and, in many cases, trauma associated with child welfare. And these experiences and relationships had to be navigated very carefully. So it was very emotional but empowering work. So relationship building, obviously essential for the success of the project, not always straightforward. So Sharon McCallum and Emily Potts, for instance, were assigned to the Rocky Mountain House region neither were from and they had no familiarity with. So they actually had trouble finding Indigenous people to talk to. They couldn't locate them. So they spent a lot of their time just knocking on doors in the communities and trying to seek out Indigenous people, which sounds really weird, right? They got a little bit of help from local nurses, a little bit of help from others in the communities, but even when they ended up talking with people and finding the Indigenous people, they found many of the families were very reluctant to talk to them. So, unfamiliarity with McCallum and Potts might have been a primary reason for reluctance, but it could have been other people's past experiences with the child welfare system. Too much familiarity could also be a liability, as we might imagine. So if you were working in your own community, you might be able to find Indigenous people a little bit better, you know who they are. But you could also end up finding unsuitable homes and getting pressure to approve them, or knowing the families where children were at risk of apprehension. So that didn't always work well either. Since outreach was a cornerstone of the project, VANIS just tried to use all the tools it had at its disposal. So to cover as much ground as possible, it also held 22 community workshops with field workers and other staff. And these tended to be organized by VANIS board members that were located or from these communities. And workshops invited participants to try to pinpoint and discuss the challenges that they saw in Indigenous child welfare. Board members were pleasantly surprised how well attended the workshops were and the enthusiasm of the attendees. The VANIS final report said that attendees were, quote, happy and pleasantly surprised that the department really did want Native people to become foster families. Given the reality of Indigenous child welfare and the reasons for child removal, it's understandable that Indigenous families would conclude that social services devalued their work as caregivers. And of course, Indigenous people were correct in many ways. So though in Alberta, most of the officials participating in this initiative appeared genuine in their attempts to make systemic changes, of course, there's this legacy that preceded them. The workshops also underscored a very profound disconnect between Indigenous and non-Indigenous understandings of child welfare and protection, and preventable financial barriers to keeping Indigenous children in Indigenous homes. And a key issue was a culturally inappropriate definition of care that was then weaponized against Indigenous families as justification for apprehensions. So the terms under which child welfare and well-being were evaluated by social workers and child welfare experts tended to be very colonial and discriminatory. Most professionals had no cultural training and therefore followed Euro-Canadian standards of childcare to inform seizures or apprehensions. So neglect and risk of maltreatment were the most common reasons for child welfare apprehensions across the West. And this was often very broadly, and culturally defined in ways that cast certain caregivers as inherently risky. And so that might include people with histories of substance abuse or incarceration. In 1981, a family law expert in British Columbia outlined 19 specific reasons justifying apprehensions under the banner of neglect. And those ranged from serious cases, obvious cases of abuse, to things that reflected common stereotypes for Indigenous peoples. So examples of the latter included things like, quote, found living in circumstances exposing them to an idle or dissolute life. Quote, is found guilty of petty crime or is likely to develop criminal tendencies if not removed from their surroundings. Quote, a child that is likely to be dependent on the public because of blindness, deafness, mental or physical disabilities. Quote, a child that is exposed to an infection from TB or VD where proper precautions to prevent infection were not taken. And finally, this is the last one. No, I'm not going to say all 19. A child who is habitually missing from school and liable to grow up without proper education. which I think there's a lot we can unpack in all of those. But we can see that social workers believed children were being maltreated when they were placed in the care of extended family members. That didn't jive with their understanding of what a proper family should look like. The same was true when children were living in tight quarters, where bed sharing or even a lack of beds was cause for concern. There was no recognition that traditional economies might take caregivers away from children for long periods of time, and that alternate arrangements would be needed for their care. Or that children might also accompany their parents in some of these traditional economies, hunting and fishing and trapping, making them absent from school. Bed and room sharing and multi-generational care arrangements might have reflected Indigenous child rearing practices, while in other cases, poor housing conditions and resulting illness, like TB, for instance, were directly connected to inadequate government-provided housing and lack of sanitation services. And yet, child welfare experts continued to rely on stereotypes of Indigenous people, thus the lazy or the pathological Indian, to fuel these apprehensions rather than acknowledging or addressing cultural difference and the systemic failings of the settler state. Another issue that was addressed by the VANIS workshop participants was the improper use of the Guardian Social Allowance Program that provided some social assistance or financial assistance to families caring for relatives, but at a rate that was far less than standard foster care amounts. Field workers learned that many Indigenous families just arranged informal kinship placements, and some of them did this in a deliberate attempt to avoid departmental involvement. We can understand why. Many also didn't know that financial assistance was available to them. So in making these choices, Indigenous families were financially penalized, either through reduced funding or in some cases not receiving any help at all. Kinship arrangements were common, not least because they followed traditional Indigenous values that prioritized extended families, but also because Indigenous people justifiably distrusted social welfare agents. Unfortunately, many families were finding that they were unable to support additional children without the kind of financial support that other foster families received. I also think that the extensive formal and informal kinship placements that were happening in Alberta at the time and elsewhere also revealed how Indigenous families were already operating their own community-based child welfare systems, only without state recognition or legitimacy or support. But workshop participants also mourned the lack of approved Indigenous foster homes, group homes, and emergency receiving homes that could relieve the financial burden kinship arrangements placed on relatives, while also preventing Indigenous children from being removed from their communities. Groups quickly identified the overall lack of community resources and preventive services such as babysitting and addictions programs and recreation as contributing to family breakdown and child removals. So VANIS used the information gathered from these sessions to inform its field workers and the work that they did in communities, as well as in its recommendations in its final report. Now, through all this, I have to just emphasize that VANIS and the field workers were still working within the existing child welfare system. And this meant working directly with Alberta foster care social workers and working with them to call on potential foster homes and make recommendations for approval. And the reasoning behind this was to ensure that the newly trained field workers had someone experienced in social work to help evaluate homes and families and to answer any sort of specific department-related questions. The structure of the program also meant that even if the provincial social workers weren't present at a visit, the VANIS field workers didn't have a final say in the approval. The final say in the approval of the homes rested with those social workers. This arrangement did not sit well with everyone, and it also didn't work particularly well in some areas. Throughout the project, some social workers were more involved than others. Several field workers reported that they pretty much operated alone. Some field workers reported difficulties in building relationships with community members during the visits because many remained rightfully suspicious of the social workers. And again, the authority of the social workers to either approve or deny potential homes was challenging and really hampered field workers' abilities to recruit. So one field worker, Violet Patnod, insisted that some social workers did not look at the homes quickly enough to take advantage of interest. And in some cases, possible homes went unapproved because a social worker wasn't present in the community at the time to make a recommendation. And so many were viewing this lack of urgency or even presence as, a threat to the overall project and its goals. The project really hinged on this idea of being proactive and quickly shoring up the numbers of foster homes. And so to not have that quick buy-in from social workers was really problematic. Adding to this tension were the high instances of Indigenous foster homes that failed the provincial child welfare approval processes. So Lena Bumstead and Lac La Biche field worker Florence Whitford lamented that there were several homes that they thought were perfectly suitable for fostering, but the local social worker disqualified them. Rather than quietly referring to the expertise of the social worker, Bumstead and Whitford reported their frustrations to the VANIS executive. And they specifically criticized the lack of involvement, but also the inconsistent expectations and standards between the field workers and the social workers. How could they work together if they weren't on the same page? Justifications for disproving homes included not having enough space to accommodate more children, unclean homes, or similar indicators of poor living conditions. And that was a standard phrase, similar indicators of poor living conditions. Disappointingly for many field workers and potential families, these expectations were exactly what made families wary of volunteering in the first place. So Clara Woodbridge reflected that the families she visited were, quote, concerned about not having an extra bedroom for the child and that their homes were not modern with up-to-date furniture and the child would have to share a room with the other children or sleep on the floor as the others did. So families and field workers were really receiving conflicting messages about whether or not this stuff mattered. This is not to imply that all the social workers were problematic. So several of them, including Florence Pearson from the Slave Lake Regional Office, were active and positive forces in the program. In her final report in 1977, Pearson extolled VANIS for its work and the impact it was having on communities. And her approach also directly countered the concerns about living conditions that Woodbridge and Cotton had shared. Instead, Pearson insisted, quote, the project has given a great many people a sense of confidence and ability to believe in themselves. It is not a mystery that we were able to find very good homes and that they have proven that you do not need a 4-bedroom home to care for and love children. Unlike some of her colleagues, Pearson was able to look past some of those Eurocentric assumptions about what constituted an appropriate home environment. And Pearson's positive outlook and the fieldworkers' determination and grit to make a difference ultimately translated into meaningful, albeit imperfect and ongoing results. So the foster care project found success in several areas. They found high rates of community participation, particularly encouraging, and they were impressed by people's willingness and eagerness to want to learn more about the child welfare system. Many of them expected that families would just kind of shut down and shut them out. Because the project was mediated through the Department of Child Welfare, involved the Department of Child Welfare, mediated through VANIS and Indigenous women, some families were actually able to foster stronger linkages with the provincial department, and so that was a real win. And I think that was critical to breaking down some of the established barriers between these groups. Project workers and social workers learned more about the unique needs of Indigenous families and their approaches to child welfare, and families were really pleased to be part of the process, that they were being asked their opinions, even if they weren't always listened to. At the end of the project, workers were also really excited to have recruited foster homes in areas and communities where none had previously existed. So in 1974, only 223 of the approximately 3,100 foster homes across Alberta were either treaty or Métis in origin, and that's the titles that they used. 63 of those were approved directly as a result of the workshops and work held in Indigenous communities. By June 1976, so the end of the project, an additional 106 Indigenous homes have been approved, and 79 were still waiting for evaluation. So despite that significant accomplishment, and it is significant, so many more homes were needed. This was ongoing. VANIS noted that approximately 44% of all children in care were Indigenous, and obviously this meant that there was a real need for more and continued work to recruit homes. So the project officially wrapped up in 1976, but members had built this important political and social momentum. And this child welfare crisis had pushed their organization, but also organizations across the West, kind of to the brink. In 1977, VANIS wanted to take a further step away from control of provincial child welfare, and Bertha Clark Jones specifically called for an end to the provincial foster care policy that placed Indigenous children in non-Indigenous homes, so just not allowing that at all. She did not get much buy-in on that. So as an alternative, the VANIS proposed developing community receiving homes with Indigenous staff until such a time that there was an adequate number of available Indigenous foster homes. So the organization and women obviously recognized that institutional settings were not ideal for Indigenous children, but that this was preferable, an Indigenous receiving home, an institutional setting where they could access Indigenous cultural teachings and language and understandings was preferable to non-Indigenous fostering. And I think that says a lot that they truly believed an institution was better than a home environment. VANIS was not alone in its calls to end the practice of adopting out, and many communities and organizations were building similar momentum. And this is where I turn to Splat-in, and I promise I don't have as much to say about Splat-in as the VANIS project. So if you're thinking like, oh my God, she's like not even halfway done, I am, I promise. So this is lovely Splat-in. This community center that was built a few years ago is made to look like our traditional pit houses, which I think is lovely. It's just like just a beautiful space, so I wanted to include a picture of it. So for Splat-in, after years of having their concerns about endemic numbers of community children placed in non-Indigenous care unaddressed, they turned to the dual strategy of direct action and legal challenges with provincial ministries. As an expression of Indigenous sovereignty and decolonization, the Splat-in bylaw for our Indian children, developed through community consensus building, provided a really comprehensive plan for Splat-in controlled child welfare. Following notions of Splat-in blood and belonging, rather than reserve residency, the bylaw proclaimed exclusive jurisdiction over any Splat-in child, regardless of where they lived. So the idea was to repatriate Splat-in children who were spread everywhere. The bylaw recognized Splat-in as collectively holding responsibility to protect community children and families, and reflected Splat-in laws and governance for the care of children. So to do this, the bylaw created new legal categories of guardianship. So drawing on Secwepemc customary governance laws where traditional kukpis or chiefs and community leaders oversaw the well-being of community members, the bylaw installed the elected chief and council as legal guardians of apprehended children. So chief and council were then supported in their guardian roles by clear mechanisms for family and community involvement in child welfare case review, child removal decisions, and placement practices. Critically, the bylaw empowered the community to determine the best interests of the child, rather than relying on provincial child welfare workers. The bylaw considered the placement of children removed from their homes very carefully, and it privileged residencies with extended family and Indigenous reserve families, which contributed to this overarching goal, I guess, of family and cultural preservation. So it had an order of preference for where children would be placed. So at the top would be a member of the extended family living on the Splat-in reserve, followed by a member of the extended family living on another reserve, followed by a band member, so not related, but a band member from the Splat-in reserve, and then finally, as a last resort, a non-Indigenous person living off reserve. So just completely flipping what the reality was. This regulation challenged provincial authority over Splat-in children, delineated and implemented customary Secwepemc values and laws regarding child welfare, and firmly established child welfare as an issue of Indigenous sovereignty. So after negotiating and adopting the bylaw at the community level, the next step was to gain legal acceptance from the provincial government. So no strangers to direct action as a method for achieving political change, Splat-in members and other supporters from across the province organized the Indian Child Welfare Caravan to travel from the Okanagan Valley to Vancouver's Oppenheimer Park on Thanksgiving weekend, 1980. The caravan was highly organized. It used coordinators and field workers from 6 regions across the province to ensure broad representation. And many of these individuals were community leaders, members of provincial organizations, and were well-versed in political mobilization. So organizers coordinated staging areas in places like Prince George and Chase, Alert Bay, Lillooet, Williams Lake, and Mount Currie, so that participants could travel together to Vancouver and kind of build momentum on the way. Once in Vancouver at Oppenheimer Park, the group planned to march to Minister of Human Resources Grace McCarthy's Shaughnessy area home to present the bylaw for legal adoption. If you know anything about Vancouver and the Shaughnessy area, it's probably a place where Indigenous people in 1980 and perhaps even today would look out of place. So the rally attracted more than 800 supporters from across the province, most of whom had taken part in the caravan and had been involved in discussions about child welfare issues in their own communities. At Oppenheimer Park, Splat-in Cookpee Wayne Christian criticized Human Resources' handling of its $8.5 million budget to care for Indian children, noting that 15,000 had been taken into care in Canada in 1977 alone, and 67% of these children ended up in non-Indigenous homes. Christian further lamented that Indigenous children made up the bulk of children in care, hovering around 40%, despite only representing 2% of the population. He told attendees, "What we are saying as a people, as parents, as grandmothers, as leaders within our community, is that we want the right to get those resources the province is getting. We want the right to care for our own children." Christian pointed to the number of children from the Splat-in community that included his own brother, who were adopted out as little children and had now grown up not knowing their fathers and mothers and aunties and uncles. And for those who returned to Splat-in later in life, Christian noted they don't know who they are. They've been taught for so long how to live by the white man's ways. Others in the crowd came up to share stories of family dislocation, losing children to adoption, and once the speakers had finished, the group marched and drummed and sang their way to McCarthy's home. And the decision to descend on McCarthy's house was both strategic in terms of her decision-making abilities as a minister, but also a very pointed response to her recent comments on Indigenous child welfare. So she had made an address in 1980 to the BC Indian Homemakers Conference, blaming Indigenous communities and organizations like the Homemakers at their own conference for failing to find Indigenous homes for Indigenous children, ensuring that the child welfare crisis would continue. Homemakers members, including several grandmothers who were caring for their grandchildren and other foster children, were very quick to challenge McCarthy's ignorance. They reminded McCarthy of solutions that the homemakers had been proposing since the early 1970s to develop foster homes, to be part of the decision-making process, and to develop preventative services for struggling families, but each of these suggestions had either gone unanswered or had been rejected. So many of the homemakers who participated in the caravan and marched to McCarthy's house had a litany of long-standing grievances. Others also had direct frustrations with McCarthy and her office. So Sachot, grandmother and foster parent Agnes Dick, insisted that the economic barriers grandparents and other Indigenous peoples faced were the primary hurdles to providing homes for children. And specifically, they took issue with the Ministry of Human Resources policy not to pay caregivers foster care subsidies when they were looking after family members. So this is sort of like what VANIS members heard in Alberta, but in BC, the funds were simply not made available. So that child welfare agencies would pay non-Indigenous families to care for Indigenous children, but not Indigenous families, became a long-standing point of contention where advocates insisted that agencies financially incentivized the fostering and out-adoption of Indigenous children. So Indigenous children had become commodities for non-Indigenous parents and then were denied placements in family homes because Indigenous families couldn't afford to pay for them. So when the caravan participants arrived at McCarthy's home, they were armed with established concerns that the minister had already proved unwilling to address when given many, many previous opportunities. So the caravan was linked directly to the bylaw. It formally took place on Thanksgiving weekend, but it also had roots in existing conversations around British Columbia. So there were a number of Indigenous women in the interior of British Columbia who had started these conversations, who had appointed a Christian as spokesperson for the movement, who had identified McCarthy as the target of direct action. And so when Christian presented the bylaw on behalf of his community, he also spoke to Indigenous child welfare issues across the province generally. In a closed-door meeting with Christian, McCarthy agreed that First Nations should control their own child welfare programs, and ideally, Indigenous children should remain with their communities. McCarthy was very careful in how she characterized the challenges of child welfare. She denied that children were needlessly removed from their homes. She defended her staff against charges of malice and racism-fueled apprehensions, insisting, quote, "Our staff are sometimes depicted as kidnappers who swoop down on Native families and take children away from for their own reasons. Nothing," she argued, "could be further from the truth." Still, McCarthy conceded that liaising with the bands to ensure that the arrangement of Indigenous foster homes was desirable. And so the resulting agreement, signed by Christian and McCarthy, recognized the legal validity of Splat-in's bylaw. It also stipulated that Splat-in children could return home if they desired to. But much to the disappointment of others who've been part of the movement, the bylaw was limited to Splat-in, and so no other bylaws after that were allowed by the ministry, and some communities felt left out or perhaps shut out of the benefits that had been gained from the collective action of the caravan. So the impact of both of these things, the Splat-in bylaw and the VANIS foster care project, had remarkable impact across the West. Communities elsewhere struggled with record high apprehensions and family breakdown. And so the foster care project obviously had the immediate effect of increasing Indigenous foster homes, but it also spurred the creation of other programs in other communities, and largely through the work of individuals who were involved in the VANIS project. So at the Kainai Reserve, they created their own Foster Parents Association and worked to develop 28 foster homes on their reserve, which became the highest number of Indigenous foster homes on any one Alberta reserve. Indigenous people were also paying attention to the bylaw, and they continued advocating for change in their own communities. The bylaw was shared very widely across Canada, but the Canadian government quickly closed a loophole that allowed that bylaw to be accepted by Splat-in. The bylaw model ended with Splat-in. In 1985, the New Tribal Council managed to develop British Columbia's first delegated First Nations agency, but even after that, there was a moratorium placed on reserve First Nations agencies that remained in place until 1991. So it was very clear that the government provincial and federal governments did not really want to change their approach too much to child welfare. recent accomplishments like the Calluses Agreement was a recognition of inherent rights. And I think that speaks to the tenacity of Indigenous communities, but also that long-standing resistance of the settler state. And so just very briefly to conclude, the unity that we can see in these groups coming together, their continued assertions that Indigenous children were overrepresented in care and overrepresented in white foster homes because of social welfare experts and policymakers' failure to understand cultural differences in caregiving practices. They also understood that colonialism played a huge role in creating circumstances of poverty and addictions and family violence that all factored into greater rates of contact with the child welfare system. So they responded with interrelated but very unique and flexible responses. And these solutions were partial and flawed in their own ways, not least because they depended on the support and approval by several government agencies, but also because Indigenous child welfare challenges had multiple and shifting causes and manifestations that required responsive and flexible solutions. And so it's this persistence by Indigenous women that I find really important and memorable in this work. Just this proof that Indigenous women and communities demanded to be in control of their own children and what happens in their communities that I find really important. So thank you. I went long, didn't I?
No, that's great. That was sorry, remember the mic. That was wonderful in many different respects.